Hello, I'm Lucy Delap. I'm a historian at the Faculty of History in Cambridge, and I work on 20th century history, in particular on the history of feminisms. I'm going to talk today about the question of the vote for women and what difference it made. Now, this is a bit of a different story from maybe the more familiar story of how women got that vote, which is something that lots of people will have come across in films and in books and in the school curriculum. I think it being around 100 years since women were enfranchised, some women initially in 1918 and then all women on the same basis as men in 1928. It's a good moment to think about what difference it made in terms of feminist campaigning, in terms of policy, in terms of how women were incorporated into public life. And I think this is an important story because we're seeing a moment today where gender equality, gender justice are very visible in today's public debates. We've seen big debates about the inequalities in terms of the distribution of care work in households. That came out particularly strongly during the COVID-19 pandemic. We also see it as a time when questions of violence, the violence that women encounter in their own homes, on the streets, have led to a great deal of campaigning by women and non-binary people around the kind of pervasive nature of the violence that they encounter. We're also witnessing a time when party affiliations are a bit disrupted. So it's an interesting moment to look back at the history of politics and of political parties. Today in the UK, the questions are raised by Brexit or by Scottish nationalism, by the impetus behind big extra parliamentary campaigns like Black Lives Matter, or the difficult questions around the climate crisis. All these things are disrupting party affiliations and making it less clear what the political spectrum looks like. And I want to suggest today that the moment where women were enfranchised was similarly a moment where party got a bit disrupted. And it's an interesting moment to look at that fluidity and ask what came out of that disruption. So broadly, I'm going to look today at three things: what changed, and then three things that I think did not change. So we're going to look at women's political exercise of political influence outside of parties, at their campaigning strategies, and at their influence on legislation as three sites where I think we can see some change. And then we'll look at three sites where there's less change in relation to the personnel of politics, the question of party and how party works, and also the kind of wider cultural question of political culture. What is the common sense, if you like, of politics? So let's look first of all at women's sites of influence and their campaigning. In 1918 and 1928, when there were those two moments of enfranchisement for women in the UK, women already had a great deal of political power and influence, although not necessarily exercised, of course, at the ballot box. They had participated traditionally in elections in the 19th century, in activities such as heckling in public speaking, in chairing candidates, wearing colours, shopping according to their political affiliations. And of course, they voted as local government voters from 1869 if they had the property and the residence requirements. Women were elected as members of poor law institutions, they were on school boards, they were in vestry councils and so on. And that was particularly important at that sort of late 19th century moment because the government was taking on new responsibilities for things at the local level, such as healthcare, child welfare, education, utilities, and so on. And for some women, I'm thinking here of aristocratic women, they had the ability to intervene politically through their social activities, through hosting salons, through their activities as wives and mothers. Thinking here of the networks in particular of Lady Randolph Churchill, Jenny Churchill, who was the mother of Winston Churchill, who was enormously politically influential through her friendships, through her kinship, through her affairs, through the kind of socializing that she hosted in the late Victorian and Edwardian years. And for the last 3 years of her life, she was also a voter, but that was by no means the high point of her political influence, which was exercised more informally. And in some ways, one of the surprising changes that came about with enfranchisement is women lost some of these forms of influence. Politics was moving into the mass media, and hosting dinner parties or friendship networks became a more subdued part of political culture. We can also see a site of change in campaigning strategies. Famously, women suffragists adopted grand spectacle, whether those were pageants and pilgrimages and marches, or whether they were the very famous militant actions of arson and graffiti and breaking windows. Now, those militant practices and the grand marches took second place really to more insider strategies of women trying to exercise power through, let's say, select committees or departmental committees or lobbying or writing books or pamphlets. And historian Brian Harrison has described the feminists of this period in the UK as what he calls prudent revolutionaries, so rather different from that suffrage era. There were some sites where militancy carried on. I'm always fascinated by the Church League for Women's Suffrage, which changed its name in 1917 to the League of the Church Militant, and which took up practices like throwing soot at clergy or silent picketing of church services. So they maintained that kind of militant stance. And I think that carried on really through the 1920s and leads us to be a bit cautious about a sort of clear breakpoint around enfranchisement. But I still would argue that a lot of those militant strategies really fade in the 1930s, and women's ordination wasn't achieved until 1994, which gives us a sense of the kind of slow pace of change. But that doesn't mean that no progress was made. So let's turn now to an area where I think some historians have argued that there was a great deal of success for feminist and women campaigners. Pat Thane, a historian, has argued that if we look at the legislation of the interwar years after women were enfranchised, we can see a great many successes. Women were admitted to sit on juries in 1919. They were appointed as magistrates from 1920. They were very involved in the League of Nations, both at the kind of grassroots level and in Geneva. They were campaigning on birth control. They were campaigning on divorce reform successfully, on child custody. On all these issues, we can see some success. And my own research on child sexual abuse also suggests that there was a very successful campaign mounted to try to change public opinion and change the approach of policy. But there is a counter school of thought on this, and historian Martin Pugh has argued that lots of the changes that we see in relation to things like being magistrates or divorce reform, these were things that kind of were already set in motion. And the campaigning of women was sort of just closing up loopholes or regularizing discrepancies in the law rather than substantively changing anything. So he says, yes, some short-term sort of tidying up, if you like, but in the longer term, much less influence. And we can even see areas of retrogression, such as some medical schools rejecting the women students that they had taken previously and closing up those rights curtailed in the 1920s. So let's maybe use that moment to turn to our three sites of less change. First of all, in terms of personnel, lots of the key suffrage leaders did not go on to be involved in politics after enfranchisement. Emmeline Pankhurst did affiliate with the Conservative Party, and she died just before she was about to contest the Whitechapel seat in the 1929 general election. So she would probably have had a career in politics, but passed away. A few women got involved in the far-right movements, the fascist movements of the interwar years, perhaps because their involvement in suffrage had given them a bit of a taste for marching and sort of military-style uniforms and discipline and so on. Christabel Pankhurst, a very prominent leader, stood unsuccessfully in the 1918 election on a sort of radical right, pro-imperialist platform into which she sort of wove a claim about women's rights as consumers, but not a very obvious feminist platform in many ways. Perhaps reflecting this, we can see in party politics very little change. This is another site of lack of change. There were very small numbers of women MPs across this period, about 2 to 4% of MPs in the House of Commons were female across much of the 20th century. And perhaps crucially, that 2 to 4% was not concentrated in any one party. And that meant that there was no sort of obvious party that really took up women's issues in a significant way. Instead, women's activities tended to be centered on the work of their party in sort of distinctive party loyalty fashion. And that really allowed political parties to keep their hold on British politics, where there had been fears that if women were enfranchised, party would just kind of dissolve and new parties would emerge that reflected women's interests. So in terms of women's participation, there's very, very slow gains until the 1980s, and there's a kind of modest upturn, and then actually quite a sharp upturn in the 1990s. That's the period where the personnel of politics really seems to be changing. What caused this? Well, I think it was because the Labour Party calculated that it had been women's votes that caused their 1992 defeat, John Major's victory. And they were determined to prioritise women's issues as they saw it and women candidates. So the Labour Party adopted all women shortlists from 1993. That was ruled illegal in 1996, but a lot of those candidates had already been adopted and remained in place to contest the 1997 election, which was a landslide for the Labour Party, and which saw lots of women take their seats. Those gains don't necessarily stayed won, and it's interesting that in 2001 we see a drop-off of numbers of women, but numbers rose again in subsequent elections up to about 34% of all MPs in 1921. Important, though, to note that even though we have a kind of reasonable slice of the House of Commons representing women, they're still very underrepresented in other roles, such as parliamentary private secretaries, and in particular as special advisors. That's an increasingly important and rather invisible role in British politics, where they make up about 15% of special advisors. A few women in the 20th century had tried to avoid party and had entered politics as independents, figures such as Eleanor Rathbone, who was one of the most successful, who really appealed to that idea of stepping back from party being a kind of stranglehold on political imagination. But I would say that Rathbone was an unusual figure, and in fact, party lines do reassert themselves very strongly across the 20th century. There was a real fear, in fact, in some parties, particularly the Labour Party, that feminists and women represented a kind of fifth column, a sort of a group who would bring in a sort of alien agenda, whether a feminist agenda or a far left agenda. So even though some women were promoted to front bench, I'm thinking here of Margaret Bomfield, the first women cabinet minister in 1929, there was no real building on that act to create a broader perspective. And in the Conservative Party, very, very small numbers of women, even though some women did make it to become party leader and prime minister. So finally, let's just have a little think about political cultures, because I do think that this very piecemeal presence of women in political life reflects the fact that party political cultures are not very friendly to them. Women were offered separate social facilities at Westminster, and many female MPs felt that they never really gained the right to access the kind of key sites of the House of Commons. Women only gained the right to sit in the House of Lords as life peers in 1958 and as hereditary peers in 1963. So their very low numbers in both the Lords and the Commons meant that they were still seen as kind of exceptional. One of them, who was a female MP in the 1920s, recalled that she was being pointed out to visitors, quote, as if I were a giant panda, end quote. And we know from recent scandals in Westminster of the 21st century that cultures of harassment, including sexual harassment and bullying, have often been very, very negative for women, with particularly women at the more junior levels reporting it being a very difficult culture in which to feel at home. So the overall message for the talk today is that we need to see women's suffrage not as a kind of one-off big change that was achieved in 1918 and then 1928, but rather a change that favoured some elements of women's participation in political life, but not all, and that the dominance of mainstream parties has really prevented the emergence of a more activist feminist perspective. And we've been able to see that by reflecting, as historians always want to do, on ideas of short, medium, and long-term change. And some changes took many decades to emerge in the aftermath of suffrage. And I think that's how a historical perspective can help us understand this big picture of women and feminist political activism in Britain. Thanks very much for listening.